Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Nordic APIs livecast. My name is Bill Doerrfeld, and today we'll be exploring Agentic AI and GraphQL, specifically how GraphQL might be used to orchestrate Agentic AI workflows. Now, that's a mouthful of pretty trendy topics, and really, Agentic has been thrown around a lot lately. It's kind of the new catch-all term for AI enthusiasts. How I define agentic AI is, well, it's a growing paradigm where AI systems take more autonomous actions and coordinate multiple services on the back end. And folks in the API space are rightfully pretty excited about this new movement because these actions hinge on making a lot of API calls and chaining their behaviors. And so that gets us to GraphQL. GraphQL could be an impressive solution to help here. I mean, it's already great at aggregating multiple APIs into a unified layer, which could help greatly orchestrate these sort of calls. It's a potentially strong backbone for agentic AI because unlike REST, GraphQL enables precise data fetching and dynamic interactions, making it an interesting fit for agentic AI workflows. But of course, as we'll dig into in the event today, there are some potential drawbacks here, and giving AI a lot of autonomy will require governance, establishing guardrails for access control, new types of caching and rate limiting. And we're also seeing some novel vulnerabilities present themselves when we're talking about this new paradigm. So we've got a panel discussion today. We're bringing in some great GraphQL and API experts to explore this new area. We have with us Abhijit Dey, Senior Vice President of Axis Bank, Derric Gilling, CEO of Moesif, and Andrew Carlson, Principal Field Architect at Apollo Graph. So yeah, let's dive into discussion. Usually we do some introductions, but I feel like we have a lot of ground to cover today. If you guys don't mind, we'll just throw your bios in the description for the event. First off, let's kind of set the stage here. I mean, what does agentic actually mean? And how is this different between AI agents and agentic workflows? Like, what's the difference there? Abhijit, do you want to start this one off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bill, and thanks for joining me here and hosting me here also, right? So to me, agentic means a capacity, right? Or a capability of a system. So let's say there is a system, it can act, react, or proact very, spontaneously. It runs on its own intelligence. It can figure out that what its users want, what its user can want or may want, right? So that is called agentic to me, right? Now, if I go back to agentic AI is particularly a system which is actually running on top of an AI. And that AI, it can be an LLM, it can be any other ML platform, but it will run on a very proactive way on its own intelligence, right? For example, let's say a customer, he has gone to his travel app, right? And there he has asked that I want to go to Paris. That's a simple question. I want to go to Paris. Can you help me book my ticket? Now, ticket booking is just a one question. But if you really want to go to Paris from whichever geography you are, there are so many other things you need to do. You need to book your visa. You need to book your hotels, right? You need to book your packages, right? There are so many things. Now, an agentic AI-enabled system should have that much intelligence that it will do all these other tasks also. It will check your calendar. It will see whether you have your leaves available or not, right? Which you have not asked that system to do, but still the system is doing it for you, right? That is agentic in nature, if you ask me. And agentic AI is that the AI capability that actually help you to build this type of capacity to a system, right? So to me, this is agentic.
Fantastic. Andrew, do you have any other thoughts? Maybe something to contrast here, or do you agree with Abhijit?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The way that I think about the difference between AI agents and an agentic workflow is akin to thinking of the difference of whether or not something is a robot or not. right? So we can say that a robot is something that is autonomous and it kind of operates on its own, and it maybe pulls things in from the environment around it, but it has a job to do and it does it on its own. So think of like a Roomba or one of those little house cleaning robots, right? Whereas an agentic workflow is something that we pre-program and it doesn't go out and learn anything on its own. It doesn't really operate independently. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different ways to define the difference between agents and agentic workflows, but I think it really comes down to autonomy, and whether or not it can learn and respond to the environment around it and sort of like have a failure mode, and self-healing a little bit there.
Would you say agentic workflows are more deterministic then?
Yeah, I would. I would say agentic workflows are more like you. I think that is sort of one of the ways that we started out, with building out some of these AI experiences. A little bit more workflow driven, where you're building out a workflow and you're saying, okay, for each of these stages of the puzzle, I, a human, am going to be in the loop and determining which different agents maybe are involved in going out and doing these independent tasks. Whereas a true AI agent, which I think we might still be a little bit away from, is a little bit more autonomous, and we just say, "Hey, I need you to go do this thing. You go figure it out. I'm gonna get out of the way," right?
Interesting. Derric, do you have any thoughts on comparing AI agents and agentic workflows?
Yeah, I always thought of AI agents as somewhat the task at hand, like a worker of some sort. But then when we talk about agentic AI, it's a little bit more of a, I guess, orchestration higher level, right? It's almost like a higher level thinking of which agents to use, which workflows to trigger, and it could be even determined based off of pricing and getting the right tool, the right data for the right job. Where I guess in some ways it's ambiguous, and it's dependent on the context, and I think that's why we're having this discussion around GraphQL, just given some of that ambiguity that you would see.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Because it seems like there's more orchestration and you might be linking together multiple agents, so it's more higher level. Can you guys help us also understand some practical examples of end user experiences with agentic workflows? Abhijit, you already mentioned the travel booking use case, which is a great example. Are there any others that really come to mind when we're talking about this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, if we talk about banking, right? Now, suppose you have a login to your mobile banking app, right? Now, when you have logged into your mobile banking app, you can see there are a few hundred experiences, services, right? Right from your deposit to lending to cards, payments, right? There are multiple services. Just imagine how many these services you use frequently. If I'm not wrong, and since I know few people from different geographies who are also working in this space, and based on those info, right, I do believe that there are hardly 10, 15 services in any mobile banking app normally people do use. Right? Now just imagine an agent that it's there in the app, and that agent figures who you are, what are your needs, and based on your needs, based on your persona, based on your your demand, your need, your spending pattern, and everything, it figures all those services which are very much relevant to you, and it will show you over there, right? Now, how it will do that? Obviously, agentic AI, the AI being implemented here, the AI being in action here is agentic AI. AI agents are those agents through which this difficult task is being able to complete it. What Derric just mentioned, that it's more on the action part, right? Now workflow, where workflow comes here, if you see all these tasks you can do by calling multiple APIs, right? Earlier we used to talk about API orchestration. Nowadays with this agentic workflow, this orchestration has become more simpler, more easier, right? And we'll be calling API, but in a very workflow nature, right? So for every user, there will be an agent. That agent will be empowered by multiple workflows, right? So this is a practical example where I can correlate it, right? There can be many other examples. For example, if you see in e-commerce app, right? suppose you are using Alibaba or you are using Amazon, right? Now in Amazon also, your grocery can be ordered, or any household stationery goods can be ordered, right? Now there will be a time in every month where when you actually order grocery, right? You don't order grocery throughout the month. Now the agent in that app can figure your demand based on a context. So this context training and everything will be done at the agentic layer, and the workflow will be created at agentic layer so that these actions will be done, right? So that's what is a practical example just came into my mind, right? I would love to hear from Andrew and Derric also.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other ideas from the other two here on the call? And I'd really like to understand also the role of APIs behind these workflows. I mean, as Abhijit mentioned, so many are just powering the average banking application. And to underscore his point, the latest Postman State of the API report found between 26 and 50 APIs power the average application. So it must be at the core of a lot of potential use cases. What else do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was actually going to use grocery shopping as an example, but I think that like pulling it out as a meta question is, I really think that the most interesting use cases for agentic workflows are the tasks that we find menial and uninspiring. Some people might really love grocery shopping. It might be a highlight of the week to go out and pick out like all of their, like very specific produce, go into the grocery store, and like pick those perfect ingredients for a meal. But for others, it might not be. It might just be more of a chore. And I think that like some of the best examples are things that we need to do that might require pulling in information from a bunch of different sources. So for grocery shopping, it could be like favorite recipes, recipes that you've had pinned that you like are interested in trying, and then an API for the local grocery store, or maybe just something like a delivery service, right? But you have a few different APIs there that you're interacting with. And that's not even taking into account, if you have anything that can kind of like measure what you bought in the past and maybe measure stock levels or things like that. The other thing to think about, I guess, is like a little bit even more menial, like paying the bills, paying for, this kind of goes back to the banking example, but there's more that goes into the personal finance realm than just banking itself, right? Like you got to pay the utilities, you got to pay the cell phone bill, manage your finances, things like that. And each one of those independent services has one or multiple APIs underlying it as well. And so there are opportunities, I think, there for sort of like abstracting some of the more menial tasks and using those as examples of agentic workflows. Whereas some things are really fun, like planning a trip, right? Like you kind of want to get into the weeds a little bit and think about where you're going and get a little bit excited. So I don't know. I think that there are different sides of the agentic workflow depending on whether or not you're talking about a more consumer use case or a more B2B business case. On the B2B side, I'd say like anything that was previously a 10-step Zapier workflow is probably ripe for disruption in this new world, because it was just a series of menial tasks that took data from a bunch of different APIs. Maybe it transformed them very lightly and put them into a Google sheet and then did something else, right? That's a pretty good example of something that you could probably both integrate and orchestrate across APIs and also move into this more autonomous workflow.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I'd love to get to the GraphQL element of all of this, but Derric, do you have anything else to say on those specific examples of API-heavy menial tasks that you really see this being optimized for?
I think the Zapier analogy that Andrew brought up is a good way to look at it. Is we have all these APIs under the hood, but then we have agents that are going to be using those APIs regardless of different ways, MCP and the like. But then at the highest level, it's okay, how do you orchestrate everything, right, to accomplish something grander or bigger? The grocery shopping example has so many different components to it, from paying the bill to picking out the actual items to think about, what is the meal that's going to be planned and everything else. So, but I think we pretty much covered it.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's dive a little bit deeper here. What is the value of using GraphQL then in this context, and how could it be used to aggregate data and services and orchestrate calls behind the scenes of these agentic AI workflows? I'm going to hand this over to you, Andrew.
Yeah. So I think that GraphQL is a really interesting a really interesting technology to evaluate for this specific use case, and specifically around the idea of orchestration. It is certainly my favorite way to use GraphQL. That every technology has a few different ways you can use it, but with orchestration in particular, GraphQL really shines because you have the opportunity to bring in data from all of these different data sources. Some of them may be APIs, some of them can be other services, microservices, systems. You can do direct to database if you want to. You can pull in data from all these different sources and orchestrate all in one centralized location. So when I think about sort of like the value that a specific technology can bring, we're looking at the technologies from a set of trade-offs when we're identifying how we can potentially orchestrate across all of these different APIs. And today, LLMs on their own are not necessarily, and I'm just using LLM because that's probably like the most common way that we think about these agentic workflows is through a large language model being the underlying model. But most of these LLMs on their own aren't really optimized for or really built for reaching out and doing independent API requests and sequencing across a bunch of different APIs. And so if we think about sort of like the jobs to be done, the LLM needs a bunch of data to satisfy a request, or the agent needs a bunch of data, and it might not all be coming from a single location. And so this is where sort of taking that need for data to be orchestrated across many services and moving it external to the system operating the LLM can be a benefit and a boon, because we can basically inject determinism into a less deterministic process by taking a separate system and wrapping it in a known technology like GraphQL and using that as a way to or doing our orchestration at that external location.
When you frame it like this, is it like a meta schema or some sort of super graph that sees all the underlying components? How is it presented to the AI?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different ways to do it, and I've experimented with a few of these. We've seen some customers put these into production as well. There are, I would say, like I said, a few different ways. One is you do have sort of this, you expose the entire schema to the agent and say, here's everything that you can possibly request. Go ahead and structure your own query and go figure it out. And there are some performance and security and economic implications with doing that I think we're going to get into in a bit here. But another way of doing it is at that deterministic layer, at that orchestration layer, you're doing your mapping, you're creating your schema, you're identifying all of the different data sources and APIs that you're pulling from, and you're declaratively identifying that at the GraphQL layer. But then what's actually being exposed to the LLM is a subset of capabilities. And there are a few different ways you can do that. My favorite way right now is to use persistent queries for that. So basically, you take a subset of queries at that GraphQL orchestration layer, and you say, okay, these are the allowed operations that can be executed by an LLM. And you just give the LLM that whole subset of operations. And then instead of the LLM or whatever system is making this determination, instead of basically looking at a huge schema with tens of thousands of objects and types, instead they have this like really small subset of capabilities. It's a discrete subset of capabilities like get recipes and find ingredients or place an order, right? And it's a subset of either queries or mutations, but it's really encapsulated in that persisted query list.
Right. Fascinating. And then, sorry to put you on the spot, but I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page here. Like, then what does it mean to orchestrate? What is orchestration in this scenario? Is it just like linking up API responses to new requests? And like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So the way I define orchestration here is declaratively defining the relationship between endpoints. So you have all these endpoints, right? You have orders, you have a delivery status, you have recipes, just pulling from the grocery example, right? Maybe you have an API for pulling available stores. And that act of orchestration is really declaratively defining both the relationship between those individual and discrete endpoints and also the mechanism for interaction. And by taking that orchestration, and when I say mechanism for interaction, what I mean is how you make a request, how you transform the response, if you transform the response, how you handle failures, how you do rate limiting, throttling, all of the sort of like non-functional requirements that go into developing with APIs. That kind of like fits in that API orchestration bucket. And if we move that to a separate layer, we can do that in a very deterministic way, external from the AI system, in a way that adds, like I said before, a little bit of determinism to a non-deterministic environment.
Right. Fascinating. I kind of want to turn the mic over to some other panelists here. Derric, any other thoughts on how you see agentic AI interacting with GraphQL and maybe the possible benefits of this approach?
Yeah, so whenever we think about really any AI system now interacting with these, APIs or whatever, hops they're going to go through, MCP and the like, now we start thinking about things like AI experience, right? And so AI experience is now becoming, a key thing, just like we talked about developer experience, user experience in other areas. And so, when you decide whether GraphQL makes sense or whether REST makes sense and other APIs, we now start to think about, well, what is it that we're trying to do, right? So for example, if I'm building, say, a agentic workflow to interact with, a CRUD app with a lot of different, data elements, it may make sense to, leverage GraphQL in this case because I can reduce the data set, make sure I'm only returning what is needed, for the workflow at hand and nothing more, right? And also along with how we can look at the schema and explore the schema, those are some of the benefits of GraphQL. Now, on the other hand, if I'm building, in the IoT space or a more workflow-driven type scenario, then maybe it makes sense to look at something slightly different because in this case, if you, as Andrew mentioned, if you just open the entire GraphQL API directly to these agents and agentic AI workflows, then how do we make sure that they follow the right flow and pattern? It's suddenly you have a lot of issues and problems you have to go debug and make sure it is actually doing something of real value and real use. And so thinking about, AI experience and, is this something that was valuable? Is this something that was useful? Is this something that was correct, right? And so that's something that we're going to now have to think about and bake into these designs.
Yeah. And specifically, I'm sorry, Bill, something that we've seen, is that when you do give that sort of just like that unstructured query or schema, the whole thing all at once, you run into repeatability issues because it is very possible for the LLM to create a different query using the same schema with the exact same question every single time. So it'll create a different query. It'll ask for different things. It'll include a bunch of different fields that it doesn't really need. And that's pretty hard to rein in. So that's one of the, Derric, exactly what you're saying. We've seen this exact problem where giving this whole schema all at once really leads to like this problem of repeatability in the user experience.
Right. I mean, not to be too contrarian here, but what is the point of using AI if we just want, predetermined workflows? Like, what is the benefit? Gen AI then.
I would just add to that, it's determining which workflows to trigger first with which data, right? So having, I like to say there's a cookie cutter set of things to run, right? I have a menu of 1,000 different tools and functions and ways to get data. And what are the input parameters to those different functions and tools that I can use? So it's not like a free for all. I can, query anything, but it is the workflows are deciding what to query instead of going back to the initial example. I have to have a very rigid Zapier step-by-step process that does this tool, then this tool, then this tool, and moves the data around.
Right. So it's, giving some more fluidity then, and helping determine what workflows to initiate.
Yeah, it's kind of like giving the system a toolbox of tools that it can choose from. Right. So, like if we think about the tools that we give a developer, we have IDEs, we have different SaaS services, we have different languages and frameworks. In this case, we're giving an agent a subset of very specialized tools. But, you can always provide the entire schema as an escape hatch. If none of these, if none of these, 50, 100, 1,000 persistent operations and capabilities like meet the need of the request, here's the whole thing, but only use that as an escape hatch. Only use that as a last resort.
Right.
I'm going to draw a parallel to micromanage. in this case, if we look at, from a management perspective, if you're micromanaging, you are defining step by step in Zapier, do this, do this, do this, do this, and this is what we're expected to get out. But when we start talking about these AI agents and agentic workflows, now it's, hey, here's a set of tools that you have. You have your IDE, you have your set of services and APIs you can use. This is the end goal. This is the end outcome I need. Go figure it out. But figure it out within the constraints of the guardrails that are in place, the tools that we have. Don't do something outside of those constraints that we defined.
Right. Maybe we should talk more about those potential issues and risks that we've been chatting about here. Do you guys see any drawbacks and potential security constraints that must be in place to really do this safely? I'm not sure who should talk on this one, but feel free to jump in.
Definitely. So anything that you're going to take live and expose to the internet, you have to make sure you have the right guardrails in place, right? Observability in place, authentication concerns, just knowing that, is there someone that's abusing your set of GraphQL APIs or, through an abusive agent in some case. And that abuse could be unintentional, right? Could have been just an agent that went wild and for some reason kept hammering your APIs, or it could be intentional, scraping data and building out their own data set. And so having observability in this case to make sure you are able to see those type of usage patterns, understand tool usage. On top of that, having things like quotas, limits in place to prevent these type of situations from happening in the first place. But all of the stuff that we thought about when we think about API management, API lifecycle management, and the like is going to now apply to this as well.
Yeah,
correct. I mean,
yeah,
sorry,
go for it.
if I may add here, right? Like when we all started this API management a few years ago, right? From SOAP to REST, right? Andrews, those days when we used to have a complete API management solution, right? It has the orchestration tool, it has those, managers, proxies, policy managers, right? We had all the guardrails. Similarly, for this agentic era, right? For all the agents, we need to have an agent management, right? It will have the entire control and governance over the agents, right? There should be a framework. That framework should say that which all agents will be creating, which all not. And this framework may vary from industry to industry, from organization to organization, right? Like, for example, nowadays I see there are many large organizations who have their own AI framework. When we started, we also had API banking framework, right? And maybe in Europe, you used to know as a open banking framework, right? Now here we had API banking framework. Now we are thinking about an AI framework, right? What all use cases will we touch upon? What all use cases will not? there should be enough guardrail, what type of data will be exposing, right? So similarly for agent also, there should be a framework that how these agents will be built, what all are the guardrails will be there, how these agents will talk to each other, whether it will be by via this auth mechanism or not, or maybe something else we'll be thinking about, right? I mean, I was just going through a few days ago, and a very significant line I just read that in the era of agentic AI, right, almost all the application has to be an auth producer and auth consumer, because every application will have an agent, and agent should have an authentication mechanism. So probably auth is the one that we can introduce, right? Now, this is one thing, but if I have to add one point to the previous question, right? Andrew was talking about those, data sets and all, right? If you see GraphQL, the beauty of GraphQL, what I could perceive as of now is that there are organizations where there are multiple data silos, where you have multiple defragmented data, right? Just take an example of this Amazon, if I can just give you some example, right? Suppose we are building a dashboard for a particular user. When you will be logging to his e-commerce app, you will see three choices, three options. One is wallet balance. Second, some personalized offers. And these are tailor-made offers for him. Third is the transaction history. What all transactions he has made, what all orders he has made in last 6 months or 1 year, right? Now, these are the three different applications. If I have a GraphQL here, right, the agent need not to go to multiple applications. It will create that GraphQL query. Precisely, it will fetch the information from all these three applications, whichever is needed. So there is no leakage of data. There is no more data silos. Applications will have only the data which is required, and it will display that. And then it may, remove the data from there. So from the security per se, also GraphQL itself has a very high propensity that they can actually cover many scenarios which in normal REST scenario we cannot, right? So that's why in the era of LLM, GraphQL holds a very huge significance. And on the security per se, both these applications, both these agents should have that auth. Otherwise, not a normal API call or not a normal agent calls will hold good, right? Because days are coming where there will be multiple agents working, right? There should be some governance and there should be some framework. So that's my 2 cents on this, security part.
No, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense to me. We need better authorization and authentication for agents, especially if they have so much autonomy and access to so much data through GraphQL. Maybe are there any other API like fundamental best practices that really matter in this new era? Not to make a leading question here, but I'm thinking of things like rate limiting and quotaing and throttling. Like it seems like these agents with unlimited control could do a lot of damage.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So we like to sometimes talk about even economic denial of service, and there's different ways to impact any type of API application. But when these APIs were mostly used by mobile and web, of course, most of the interactions were interactive, right? And so it's a relatively defined volume. It was easy to detect and block when a bot was scraping your website, which happened to be pinging some APIs. Now you actually have to allow for higher volumes, because some of these agentic workflows and agents are going to get pretty high in terms of the transaction volume size. So how do you now start determining, is this a real usage pattern? Is this something that looks like scraping or potentially malicious in terms of whatever data is accessing or whatever workflows it's accessing? And is it causing economic damage? Because nowadays, some of these APIs are now depending on other LLMs and models and have their own, cogs and costs to consider, right? Whereas previously, calling an API hopefully was relatively cheap. It was pennies on the dollar for each API call, but now there's a cost associated with those transactions.
Yeah, I think a good mental model for this is sort of following the path of trust that the internet did as well. And one way to think about it is just as on the internet in general, we kind of moved from a high trust to a low trust environment. I think with agents, we're now sort of moving towards this high trust, low trust, no trust, right? Like That is one way that we should think about building our APIs and hardening our APIs as well. They're all the principles, they're all the ilities that we've always known about. Security, observability, having rate limiting and throttling in place, the monitoring, right? All of those sort of all of the things that we've been preaching about for years and years, they mattered a lot less, very little in a very high trust environment when there were a small number of people using the internet, and generally the people using the internet were academics or students or whatever. But then as we started like bringing in a lot more people to use the internet more broadly, we started having more attack vectors. I mean, well, I shouldn't say more vectors, but more people like looking for areas to attack and different things like that. Now with this idea of autonomous agents, like think of it like we've just expanded the volume and the users of the internet by like triple, quadruple, right? And when we think about sort of like that scale of increasing internet consumption, if we move towards this high to low to no trust, all of those recommendations and constraints around security, the guardrails, the authorization, authentication, they become even more important.
I'm going to move that even from no trust to zero trust, because we talk about that jargon a lot on the Nordic APIs.
Exactly.
So when we're comparing that to agentic AI, how do you build a zero trust architecture for this new era of agentic AI?
I think that is the question of the minute, right? Like everybody's trying to solve that because I mean it's a tough one. I think that the leaning on the principles don't really change. Like the idea of defense in depth, and having defense and authorization, authentication at every layer of the stack, all of that still applies. But the organizations who actually put their money where the mouth is, they will see greater success. They will be much less likely to suffer the pains of an outage or of an economic denial of service or anything like that, right? We're going to see the people who are actually walking the walk and not just talking.
Fascinating. Anything else on the security side of thing or best practices before we move on to a slightly different topic?
No, I think what Andrew said is correct, right? This entire agentic space is just a very new thing, right? Each and every week we are seeing something new is coming up, right? And we all are trying our best to guard really in all possible way. But there are a few basic hygiene that we should maintain as of now, right? For example, that authentication, authorization in every agent communication. One good thing is that also I'm not endorsing, but that agent to agent thing, right? The one Google has published last week. It actually touches on that how that agent will talk to each other, right? So the moment you are going in that direction, that means some protocol or some authentication layer will come in between, right? So that's one good thing, right? The third one is a framework I just mentioned. We should have a framework. And first of all, we should ask ourselves whether we really require agent to solve any problem or not. So whenever from business angle, if I just touch upon, right, whenever we have a problem statement, we'll have to solutionize it. But not for all solution we require AI, or not for all solution we require agent, right? There may be some solution where a normal traditional way also we can help. I mean, we can solve the problem through some API calls and all, right? So just in the zeal of making agent or AI, we shouldn't build it. If there is a proper use case, because all these things are very complex thing, right? Till that we don't have the entire confidence over it, we shouldn't build just out of enthusiasm and all. So that one thing I do believe that we should all ask to ourselves whether we should go in an agentic way or in a normal way we can solve any problem.
Right, knowing what's best for your use case and not just following the hype trends for the sake of it is important and challenging in this clustered discussion.
Yeah.
Something you mentioned earlier, Abhijit, was all the potential APIs that could be connected to enable these really interesting user experiences. But it seems like one hurdle there potentially is that you might be involving proprietary or paywalled APIs in the agentic workflow process. And I'm curious how we might get over that into the future. Maybe this is kind of forward looking, but Derric, I thought you had some input on this topic. Do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, actually it's an interesting discussion, because if you think about a paywall today in a user application, the user sees it. They enter a credit card, right? And they can purchase a SaaS application or a SaaS plan or whatever. When we look at these agentic workflows, what does that mean? Does it mean there's a hard paywall? Is it a soft paywall? Can a AI agent go out of control and blow up your credit card bill, right? In terms of whatever it is that it's going to use. And so now you have to balance two things. On one side, you want autonomy. You don't want the agent to run out of credits or be blocked at 3 a.m. And so now you have to wake up and potentially unblock a workflow that is critical to your business. But on the flip side, you also don't want to wake up and see a $50,000 bill because it went a little wild and just didn't have the right guardrails in place. And so, when we think about paywalls as, someone that's creating these tools for AI agents, it also means ensuring that they're right, whether it's observability for customers, the right guardrails in place to detect when something may not be usual in terms of the spend or the usage, or potentially having a paywall, but having the paywall at the right point, right? Because you don't want to block people or block agents at 2 a.m. And so that may be a much higher quota limit that you'd assign versus what we would see today. Now, how is that paywall service to the customer? That's still, I think, an open discussion. There is no, I guess, portal or console to log in, right? So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how we think about paywalls and all the stuff we talk about around usage-based or outcome-based pricing is going to be very relevant for these types of workflows. So, but hey, if you're driving the right outcomes, then hopefully then it's less of a concern.
Right. Yeah, it seems like it'll hinge on the platform that's in charge of building agents or orchestrating them. Fascinating. Also, are there any situations in which GraphQL might not make the most sense in agentic AI versus some other situations, or is it really the silver bullet for everything we're discussing? Andrew, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, the answer is yes. There are situations where it does not make as much sense. I think there are plenty of situations where using GraphQL in an agentic workflow would be like using a hammer to drive a screw, where it's just like you can do it, but is it overkill? Is it the right tool for the job? And very concretely and tactically, I think it's along the lines of I think every organization will have a threshold that they need to identify for like a complexity threshold that they're trying to solve for. And what I mean by that is the quantity, the volume of data sources that they're trying to orchestrate across. I think some organizations will find that, okay, let's say we have an MCP server that is requesting data across 2 APIs. Do we need GraphQL for that? Yeah, probably not. Like we can probably get by orchestrating those 2 APIs. When you hit 5 different APIs and data sources, at that point, maybe it's time to introduce GraphQL, because you have the opportunity to pull a graph data structure into your API ecosystem. But certainly, I think once you get into the double digits, I think it warrants a discussion. But I think it will be different for every single organization. But the short answer is, if you're only orchestrating 1 to 5 APIs, it might not be time.
Abhijit, do you have any specific insights here, especially given your on the ground experiences?
No, I'll just echo what Andrew said, because I already touched upon, right? I mean, not only GraphQL, right? the framework I just talked about. Nowadays, every implementation they getting costlier. If you see, the whole world is and regardless of any political thing, I'm just taking from the business point of view, every business is struggling with the cost, right? The cost of acquisition is increasing day by day. For what are the reasons are, but it's increasing. Now, when you are implementing this type of highly complex architecture, it comes with a cost, and this will add up to your existing cost. Right? So you'll have to be very choosy, right? For example, what Andrew said, I mean, again, that Amazon experience I just talked about, right? I just have 3 features to call, and maybe for those 3 features, I need to call 4 or 5 API. I need not to have a GraphQL kind of thing, right? And MCP is there. It can directly, MCP itself is a protocol, if I've understood it correctly, right? MCP, with MCP, I can call these APIs, I can fetch the information, right? But suppose I need a very large and complex use case to solve for. For example, that, book a ticket for my Paris trip next month. Now, next month means, I mean, next 30, 40 days, right? I mean, I'll have to figure which day, which are my calendar availability, whether it's a good time to travel Paris or not, whether tickets are available, which is the best available. So there are so many decisioning to be made. Now, on those scenarios, definitely we need to call multiple APIs, and their GraphQL will be a good kill. But in normal scenarios, I don't think that it's required, right? It doesn't mean that I have any enemy with GraphQL, but the fact is that we should know what to use at what place, right? Because day by day, cost is becoming a very huge pain point for every organization.
Absolutely. Know when to use it.
Yeah.
Let's hit on briefly interesting standards and technologies that people should be keeping in mind here. We've already mentioned MCP quite a few times. Could one of you give us more of a background here and its relation into our discussion?
Sure, I can give some context there. And if I have an API, that was traditionally exposed to my SaaS application, traditionally exposed to mobile apps, single page apps, that's great, right? It's deterministic. My mobile app can call that API, and it knows exactly which parameters to call. I got an open API spec and everything else. When you talk about something like an LLM, right? How do you actually take something that's completely unstructured and convert it into something that's way more structured that an API can understand? And so I like to talk about the MCP as that glue between the two sides, right? LLM decides I don't want to just use whatever is within the model itself, but I need to call some workflow, some tool, some external data from another source, which means make the LLM platform needs to now make a call to, say, your Dropbox account, to your Google Drive account. Now, converting that to something that makes sense, that's still a tricky task. And so that's where MCP can come in, basically as that middle layer, enabling a predefined menu of tools, predefined menu of workflows that can be triggered by the LLM, and then be converted, and then your MCP server is going to go make the respective calls and other things that are necessary to make that tool happen, right?
And this middle layer, does that replace or complement what we've talked about today in using GraphQL for this purpose?
It definitely complements it. In fact, if you look at the MC protocol, it uses JSON RPC underneath the hood, right? It's in some ways, it is API calls, right? But it's a nice way to stream to this middle server before it actually starts making calls to the external sources and workflows that you have, right? So it's really just creating us almost like a standard API that then you can use to go, call the respective other workflows. But I see it as very complementary to the existing APIs out there. We're going to see a lot of MCP servers some of them will be remote, like a SaaS company will host their MCP server, to be used by LLMs and other experiences that we have never thought of. We may also see third-party, MCP servers that, cover new use cases that the vendor didn't initially think of. And so, people already think about things like MCP marketplaces and the like, just like what we saw with APIs, right? And so you can have a API that was built by a vendor, but you can also have folks who are mixing up a couple different APIs and aggregating those APIs, whether it's Zapier like stuff or something more specific.
Andrew, could you
like a marketplace? Yeah, please go on.
Well, I think there are directories emerging that are cataloging the MCP servers in terms of marketplaces or registries. Yeah, I'm not totally sure about that quite yet. Andrew, I'm curious to get your take on like how orchestration fits into this, and when we're talking about looping in MCP servers.
Yeah, I think that if we think about the topology of the architecture, that an ideal place for GraphQL to sit in an LLM-driven experience isn't between the LLM and the MCP server. It's actually inside the MCP server making GraphQL requests. That orchestration is not happening. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier, and I think that it's an interesting question to dig into. And the question is like, where do you want the complexity in your application to lie? Should that orchestration complexity be written in imperative code inside the MCP server, where inside that server you're doing all that orchestration request, or is there an actual layer that handles all of the orchestration across your entire ecosystem of APIs within an organization or even externally as well, that the MCP server then can call out to? And I think that is sort of that sort of decoupling allows both pieces to operate independently in much the same way that that a typical client server persistent record, persistent data source architecture would also apply, right? Where you've decoupled the orchestration from the orchestration execution from the caller, do the calling inside the MCP server out to this external GraphQL server.
Awesome. We should follow up on that. And I would love to see the topology and the architecture displayed somewhere as a reference implementation. We should put a pin in that. Cool. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. I do want to kind of double down on the fact this is pretty theoretical. Are there real world implementations of GraphQL powered agentic AI today, or is this a pretty forward looking discussion?
There are. Okay. There are some. There are a few different large organizations that are using GraphQL in production with their LLM-driven experiences today. There are a few really good talks out there that I can reference. Block has some good examples. And there are some talks that they've given on, they're hosted on YouTube right now, but they gave them at GraphQL Summit last year. And then another good example to look to is Monday.com. They have done they did a really great write-up a little while ago, but those are two pretty well-known and public examples of organizations using GraphQL with their agentic implementations.
Fantastic. We'll look into that. Just as a lasting thought, with all this, everything we've discussed today, is there anything else you think developers should keep in mind as they're trying to tackle this new agentic workflow era? Maybe just everyone has a second to chime in here. Derric, do you want to start?
Yeah, whenever we're building out, a new tool or technology, it always boils down to, what is the business requirements, the business goals, right? And so, I'm personally excited about the whole MCP thing, just because you can now have, maybe 100 different MCP servers with different business goals and business use cases, potentially all sharing the same APIs and underlying data sets. So have this weird fan out type situation. But at the end of the day, you're solving some type of goal, and then you can measure that goal. That's where you start thinking about monetization and everything else, because you're now tracking those outcomes, monetizing those outcomes, and that's how business value is created. And if you do it the right way, then people won't be concerned about a $50,000 bill, because hopefully there was actual value created and not just you're burning tokens or burning, if you're using a text messaging API, just sending text messages that are going nowhere and not doing anything.
Absolutely. Yeah, hopefully we can avoid that, Bill. Abhijit, any lasting thoughts?
I think we covered almost whatever came in our mind, right? And all those questions are very apt and very, time sensing. But I'm very hopeful that once this A2A plus MCP will come, right? Once I'm not very sure. I mean, A2A is quite a new thing in last 2 weeks ago only it came, right? But suppose A2A and MCP are integrated together, right? With A2A, we know how agent will talk to each other. We can have a governance over there. We can create a good agent experience. MCP, as Andrew said, I am completely with him on this. GraphQL actually sit inside the MCP, right? It help MCP to call the data points, right? And in LLM, there are multiple data sources you need to work with. Their MCP will help you, right? So A2A plus MCP powered by GraphQL, that can be an optimum example of how you can create an agentic workflow. But again, my humble request to each and everyone, right? We should first see whether we really need to go to such a complex architecture or not, right? I'm not discouraging anyone, but the fact is we need to know that whether we should go for complex architecture or with a very simple way we can solve it, right? So that one thing, and maybe this is for the where that actually AI product managers will come in picture. They can actually guide us, right? They can create that framework. So one framework is very important, right? And it should be across. Maybe AI gateway and all some technical stuff may help us, but a framework and this MCP plus A2A, this is the future which I can see.
Sane advice. Andrew, any other lasting thoughts here?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. The tools and practices that we have been using and building and honing for years are just as important now as they ever have been, if not a little bit more. And so I go back to what Derric said about leaning on the business requirements, and what Abhijit said about really focusing on asking the hard question: do we need to introduce this complexity? I think those are very related. Starting from the need of the business, starting from the job to be done, and then looking at the available tools. Do we need an agentic workflow for this? Or honestly, is it ever going to change? Or is this going to be like a one-off little task that we just need to get done and get shipped, right? Do we really need an agent for that? Do we really need to dump out a bottle of water every time that request is made? Probably not. And so, yeah, I agree. I think that starting from business requirements, looking at the jobs to be done, choosing the right tool for the job, and being AI and AI agent informed, but it is very useful, but we don't need to reach for it for every single task, every single job.
Fantastic. Knowing when those boundaries are is going to be more important than ever, I think, coming up here. Guys, thank you so much for joining me here. Derric, Andrew, Abhijit, fantastic panel discussion here today. Thank you for tuning in for this. I just wanted to leave everyone with one other lasting comment. We have the Platform Summit coming up at the end of the year. Call for speakers is still open. Sponsorship opportunities are still open. This is going to be October 13th through the 15th in Stockholm. We're going to be covering a lot of this. I imagine Gen AI, AI agents, Agentic AI is going to be pretty popular at the event, and how that's working. The interplay with like the whole API economy is very fascinating, and we'll be covering some of that at the event. So yeah, hope to see you there, and thank you so much for the great discussion today, everyone.